Move on to the next motion. I call Nick Herbert to move it.
Thank you very much indeed, Sir Christopher. I am delighted to be able to move this motion that this House has considered World TB Day and efforts to end TB globally because it was World TB Day on Sunday. But this is not an anniversary that we should be having to mark at all. It is wrong and it is extraordinary that we are still having to debate a death toll, a suffering toll from a disease that has been curable for well over half a century since the discovery of antibiotics by Fleming, indeed, in 1928. It is unnecessary that so many people die from tuberculosis. Imagine if the World Health Organization tomorrow were to announce that a new disease had been discovered, that this disease was highly infectious, that it was airborne, that it was susceptible to drug resistance, and that this disease would mean that next year 10 million people would fall sick, of which 1.6 million people would die. Imagine the global response to that news. But that is in fact a description of the reality of tuberculosis. TB kills more people every year than HIV, AIDS and malaria combined. 1.6 million people last year. Of course, there is overlap between HIV, AIDS and TB because it was the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s that was the driver of the resurgence of tuberculosis. A disease that the world thought it had beaten has come back, and it has come back with a vengeance. TB was first declared a global health emergency 25 years ago, in 1993. And since then, 50 million people have died. Just consider that. A disease is declared a global health emergency, and subsequently 50 million people die, and yet that disease is treatable and curable. That represents nothing less than a catastrophic failure on the part of the world's governments to deal with a disease that we should be dealing with more effectively. I give way to my own friend.
For giving way, and he's making some very good points. I congratulate him on securing this debate. But he mentions the failure of world governments, and there's clearly a need for greater urgency in the approach taken by the international community in dealing with this issue. But what about the behaviour of pharmaceutical companies who very rarely invest in drugs that will help people in low and middle income countries in the way they would do in lucrative medications they can sell in higher income countries, for example, Great Britain?
Well, my honourable friend makes a very good point, but I don't blame pharmaceutical companies because I think this is a clear case of market failure. The fact is that the demand for TB drugs, better TB drugs, which we need, falls largely in low and middle income countries. And so there is not a commercial case for the sufficient investment in these new drugs. It can therefore only proceed on a public-private partnership basis. There is, by some of the pharmaceutical companies, for instance Johnson & Johnson, there are pro bono programs for the drugs that do exist, in that case a drug to deal with drug-resistant TB, but that is insufficient. And that is, of course, a striking contrast, this market failure, between what happened with AIDS and what has happened with TB, because there was a serious response to the AIDS epidemic from pharmaceutical companies. Yes, partly from publicly funded programs, but also from commercially funded investment. And as a consequence, we've had this extraordinary innovation and the availability of new drugs that can prevent HIV and ensure that it is not a death sentence. What is the difference between the two? AIDS was a disease that was killing people in the West, and TB is a disease that kills the poor. That is the fundamental difference between the two, and that is why we haven't had the same level of investment in tuberculosis. There was also another fundamental difference. TB was already curable with antibiotics. It's just that these antibiotics weren't being delivered. It's just that the TB patients weren't being identified. We didn't have the health systems to do it. Give way again to my honourable friend.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. I say I'm a little more sceptical about the operation of some pharmaceutical companies than my right honourable friend is, in the fact that actually one of the reasons that the global community was able to so effectively deal with HIV and his right to identify TB as a age-defining disease is, in fact, the reason was because the international governments brought pressure to bear on pharmaceutical companies to drop the price of the medications and push medications out in lower middle-income countries. That hasn't happened with TB, and unless there is a concerted effort from global governments to encourage pharmaceutical companies to behave with that more global awareness and corporate responsibility, I'm not sure we're going to see much change in the situation that he's describing, and change is badly needed.
This is a very interesting debate, but I think I disagree with my honourable friend, because there aren't the drugs in the pipeline, because there is simply an insufficient return for these companies to make the investment in the first place. So I don't think they have the drugs that they're sitting on that are available for wealthier people that they could, if pressed, simply roll out to poorer people. There is an insufficient quantum of investment in R&D, and I will come to that, and I don't think it will be met by the private sector alone. I believe that there are three key reasons why we need to take more action against this disease: humanitarian reasons, economic reasons, and reasons of global public health. Humanitarian, because so many people are dying needlessly from this disease and falling sick. The figures speak for themselves. Economic, because this awful loss of public life and this illness also is a drag on economic success amongst our poorest countries. It's a hindrance on them to develop. But there will also be very serious economic impact of a failure to tackle the disease going forward. It is estimated that that impact by 2030 will be a cost to the world's economies of $1 trillion United States dollars if the current trajectory of TB is continued. And 60% of that cost will be concentrated in the G20. And the reason that there is that cost is because there will be 28 million deaths over that period. And that is a terrible statistic, because that is the period over which tuberculosis is meant to be beaten according to the Sustainable Development Goals. 3 years ago, the world set those goals. 4 years ago now, the world set those goals and said that these major epidemics, AIDS, malaria, TB, would be beaten in 15 years' time. We have just 11 years to go. On the current trajectory, TB will not be beaten for well over 100 years. So there will be a further 28 million deaths during that period alone, and huge economic cost. And the third reason of global public health is because of the susceptibility of tuberculosis to drug resistance. And that is because of the old-fashioned drugs that are used to treat tuberculosis. People take the drugs, do not continue with their treatment. It's a very serious fact that there are well over 500,000 cases of drug-resistant TB in the world. The highest burden is actually in the European region, and 1 in 4 people who have drug-resistant TB, only 1 in 4 people are able to access treatment. We know that there are 3.5 million missing cases of TB every year, just undiagnosed, and that is 1 in 3 people. But amongst drug-resistant cases, it's a much higher proportion. It's 71% of people with drug-resistant TB who are missing. And so this constitutes not just a humanitarian issue, it also constitutes a very serious risk to global public health because this is an airborne, highly infectious disease. Give way to my honourable friend and officer of the All-Party Parliamentary Group.
Thank the honourable member is making a very powerful case, and he's just said that actually that so many are undetected adds and compounds the risk, and that's a very important issue that needs tackling very urgently.
I strongly agree with my honourable friend, and I commend the work he does on the All-Party Parliamentary Group, which I have the honour to co-chair with my honourable friend, the member for Ealing Southall. The big problem is all of these undetected cases, and we need to find and then treat millions more people. There is hope. Last September, the UN convened for the first time a high-level meeting on tuberculosis, and it passed a very strong declaration. And that declaration recommitted the world to meet the Sustainable Development Goal target to beat this disease, but specifically it set a new target, which was to diagnose and treat 40 million cases of TB by 2022. That is a very tight timetable, and it is vital that efforts are stepped up immediately in order that we can meet that new and very ambitious target. And that will require an increase of investment in TB programs and an increase in investment on research and development. An increase from the current level of spending on TB programs globally, which is nearly 7 billion, up to 13 billion, so a significant increase across worldwide spend, and an increase in tuberculosis research and development from 700 million to $2 billion US dollars a year. And I want to just focus on 2 key issues that arise from these very ambitious new commitments. The first is accountability. How are we going to hold the world's nations to account for the commitments that they made at the high-level meeting? Because I mentioned that the world has already declared TB a global health emergency. It's already set the Sustainable Development Goals. And the problem is we keep talking about this issue, but not actually delivering in terms of sufficient global response to beat the disease. And therefore, accountability is crucial. And amongst the problems with what was otherwise a very declaration that was passed at the UN is that independent accountability was struck out of the declaration. Accountability is vital because we have to hold countries' feet to the fire for what they committed to do. And that accountability can, of course, take multiple forms. It can be done through bilateral relationships. It can be done through intergovernmental platforms at the G20, the G7, the Commonwealth, further review of the UN high-level meeting and the commitments it made. It can be done through international institutions like the WHO. But I must say that if the WHO's existing mechanisms had been effective, we wouldn't be in the position that we are now. So the first point I want to make to the Minister, who I welcome here today, is that the UK has a vital role to play in ensuring that there is more effective, sharper, independent accountability for the targets that have been set at the high-level meeting. Because without that accountability, I fear that we will not meet these new targets. And if we don't, we haven't a chance of beating the disease within the time frame that is set. And the second issue is that we cannot escape from the fact that we will need additional resource in order to meet these ambitions. And that has, of course, got to come from the countries affected, particularly from middle-income countries that have to find their own resource to deal with this. And we've seen a huge improvement in the response, for instance, from India as one example. But it also comes through multilateral institutions, and particularly the Global Fund.
And 70% of all international funding for TB comes from the Global Fund. The UK can be proud that it's the third largest contributor, but this year is the replenishment of the Global Fund. If we are to have a hope of meeting these TB targets, it's vital that the Global Fund is replenished to more than the level that we met before. The investment case requires a pledge of 14 billion from the world's countries that's 14 billion US dollars to the Global Fund. That will be combined with an increase of nearly 50% in domestic investments. So the money is also coming from individual nations. But that would suggest that the UK needs to commit £1.4 billion, which is an increase on what it gave last time, which was 1.2 billion. But that's the minimum that will be required to reach the Global Fund strategy targets. And it would be the same level proportionately to what the UK gave before to the Global Fund budget, which was about 13% of the budget. And the final point I would just wanted to make is this, because I know other honourable members want to speak, which is that as my honourable friend, who is now not here, was mentioning, the new drugs will be essential. And it's only relatively recently that new drugs have become available for tuberculosis. Until recently, there have been no new drugs for TB for over 40 years. We haven't got a vaccine. Most people don't know that. There's no effective adult vaccine for tuberculosis. No epidemic in human history has ever been beaten without a vaccine. And we have to be able to meet these new targets for an increase in research and development, which includes public funding. And again, the UK has a vital role to play in this because of the strength of our pharmaceutical sector and what we already do in relation to research and development. And we need a specific plan to implement a research strategy. We need to establish a baseline for countries to ensure that they are funding their fair share of research and development funding. And we need to establish a mechanism to coordinate that spend, because otherwise, once again, countries talk about the research and development gap, but nothing is ever actually done to close it. Sir Christopher, we should not need to be here. This is not a disease we should any longer have to be talking about. It is, frankly, a moral disgrace that we are having to talk about it. This is a needless loss of life. There are many problems that confront modern governments. Some are nearly intractable. This is not one of them. This is a disease that can be beaten. We've known how to do it for over half a century. With new tools, we could do it better. And in the words of the Stop TB Partnerships campaign around World TB Day last Sunday, it's time. It's time to beat this disease.
The question is that this House has considered World TB Day and the efforts to end tuberculosis